In the 1930s, while her husband Elijah was imprisoned, Clara Poole, later known as Clara Muhammad, quietly stepped into leadership. She wasn't given a title, but she taught the children, organized the women, and held the Nation of Islam together. In a movement that promised both protection and patriarchy, Clara found a way to lead from within. Her story is not unique. Across the early years of the Nation of Islam, Black women helped build schools, sustain families, and shape religious belief and practice, often behind the scenes, but always at the center. They navigated a religious world that asked them to submit even as it relied upon their strength. In The Promise of Patriarchy, historian Yvette Taylor uncovers the lives of these women, showing how they negotiated faith, family, and gendered expectations to shape a movement that would transform Black religious and political life in America. Today, Dr. Taylor joins us to talk about how power moves through families, how women lead in spaces that don't always recognize their leadership, and how history remembers or forgets them. Welcome to Reunion, a podcast about how family history helps us understand the past and why it still matters today. This series is sponsored by the Center for Family History and Genealogy and the Family History Program at Brigham Young University, which offers the world's only undergraduate degree in family history and genealogy. I'm Joey Stewart, and I'm here with my co-host and colleague, Christopher Jones. We're both assistant professors of history and faculty in BYU's Family History Program. In each episode, we talk with scholars, educators, and storytellers who use family history to explore big questions about religion, race, kinship, and identity. Studying families helps us see what mattered most to people in the past and how those values shape the world we live in now. Family history is more than names and dates. It is a way to explore memory, emotion, power, and connection. It gives historians a flexible method for understanding everything from slavery and migration to religious conversion and cultural memory. This is Reunion. We're glad you're here.
Yvette Taylor is a professor of African American and Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and a leading scholar of Black feminist thought. Her books include The Veiled Garvey and The Promise of Patriarchy, which explores the lives of women in the Nation of Islam and the complexities of gender and power in Black religious communities. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Eula.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to participate in this conversation.
Well, I wonder if we can start with a pretty broad question for listeners who may not be familiar with the Nation of Islam. So in The Promise of Patriarchy, you explore why Black women would join the Nation of Islam despite its explicitly patriarchal organization. Before we get into the specifics, can you provide listeners with a short introduction to the Nation of Islam?
Absolutely. The Nation of Islam is a homegrown religion. That is, it comes into existence in Detroit, the Midwest, and it comes into existence in the 1930s. And in many ways, I say it's a homegrown religion because while it leans into aspects or elements of Islam, it also creates its own iteration of how a religious life can exist in the United States in a white supremacist Jim Crow era. And so you see a combination of Christianity, of elements of the Moorish Science Temple, of the Ahmadiyya movement, of different elements that come into existence in Detroit, in Chicago, where people are just trying to figure out, how can I make a life in the Great Depression in America? And how can I lean on God to help me do that?
As someone who looks at the Nation of Islam closely in my own research, I'm often struck by the way that Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad dominate historical writing about the Nation of Islam. Part of that is because there's just way more documentation of their lives and the things that they said. But I think that we're missing something there if we see those two men, or Clara Muhammad or Betty Shabazz, as emblematic or representative of everything that a member of the Nation of Islam did or said. What did you see in the historiography that led you to want to write about women in the Nation of Islam?
In many ways, I never thought I would write about the Nation of Islam at all, let alone women in it. My first book is on Amy Jakes Garvey, the second wife of Marcus Garvey, which is a book about the Universal Negro Improvement Association and their leadership. And in this book, when Marcus Garvey was deported out of the United States, I think in 1927, many of his former members found themselves leaning into the Allah Temple of Islam, which would ultimately become the Nation of Islam. And then another book that I co-authored on the Black Panther Party, in my interviews of former members of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s, I found out that some of those members, when the FBI and COINTELPRO was, on their heels, they found refuge in the Nation of Islam. And so in many ways, I wrote two different books where in the early 1930s, former UNIA members, Garveyites, if you will, went into the Nation of Islam. And then in the 1960s, wherein former members of different iterations of Black Power find themselves going into the Nation of Islam. So it was at this point I said, you know what? I need to look at this organization because I understand the beginnings and I understand the tail ends. And so I need to figure out what happened in that big fat middle.
So why did women choose to join the Nation of Islam, which was sort of intensely patriarchal, led by these kind of not just men, but very dominant personalities and persons in Elijah Muhammad and others?
You know what? That's a great question because I think it's important to understand that there are so many different iterations of the Nation of Islam. And so the iteration of the Nation of Islam that I'm focused on is identified as the original Nation of Islam. So I'm talking about the period from 1930 until 1975, which is largely led by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Thereafter, you have different iterations of the Nation of Islam. Most importantly, leaders like Farrakhan, all of them articulating a vision where they speak about going back to the original teachings. But for my work, I'm looking at 1930 to 1975. And even in that period, there are different phases based on the way in which American history is panning out. And so in the beginnings, the 1930s, we are in the heart of the Great Depression. And you find many men and women going into not just the nation, but other religious offerings, trying to figure out how can I make a way in this climate of poverty and scarcity. And in the Nation of Islam in the 1930s, we see an organization that teaches its membership that, you know what, there is power in having discipline over your body. And so when there's scarcity of food, as we know, there are bread lines and soup lines in the Great Depression. Now those hunger pains evidence your ability to take control over your temple, and they become a sign of a certain kind of inner power. So in the 30s, we see people drawn for some of these reasons. During World War II, we see people drawn into the nation who didn't want to fight in the war, who basically felt, I am dealing with a war of Jim Crow America, not a war abroad. And so we see people pulled into the organization at that time for different reasons. During the 1950s, we see when the modern civil rights movement is coming into being, we see members joining an organization who felt like they did not want to desegregate America. They felt that the best way in which they could have a full life was to depend on each other. They were not convinced that the legal removal of Jim Crow would remove white supremacy out of their lives. And then in the 1960s and early 70s, we see members who have fought against Jim Crow, have seen the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act passed in the United States, but still see poverty all around them, still are having difficulty casting a vote. And it's at this time that some of these members of these activists say, wait a minute, the Nation of Islam, they've built a Black nation. They've built what we say that we want. So maybe I need to go back there and figure out how to create a life. So at different phases, we have folks going into the nation largely based on what the historical climate is bringing to their front door. And in the case of women, their experiences in many ways are slightly different because whether it was the 1930s all the way up until 1975, what the Nation of Islam never wavered from was promising women that patriarchy would liberate them, that a certain kind of subordination to men would provide liberation in their lives. Liberation from being a domestic because you could work in your own home. Liberation from being able to educate your children in a school wherein Black history and culture would have an element of pride where they wouldn't have to defend who they were. And so, in many ways, patriarchy liberated them from all the stereotypes of Black womanhood that kept them bound in a way that stifled their personhood.
Thank you. I think that's a really brilliant way of explaining it. The Nation of Islam asks women to do things that they are already doing because Black women are already working at home. They're already answering to their husbands. They're already living within intense patriarchal structures in private life and in public life, in employment and education. And so, in my mind, this is one of the failures of white liberalism and white feminism to see, oh, everything has to be more Django Unchained rather than anything else to be liberatory for folks. Many historians have looked at gender and family kinship networks as a source of constraint. But what I hear you saying is that it's also a source of power. What did it mean for Black women to be able to claim their agency, be able to claim their own liberation in choosing the way that they lived in a patriarchal system?
I think what's so incredibly important is how different women experience patriarchy differently. And that's one of the things that I try to underscore in the book. For example, I interview Belinda Boyd, who was Muhammad Ali's second wife, Khalila Ali, and how she experienced patriarchy is going to be very, very different from some of the rank and file women whose husbands are selling the newspaper Muhammad Speaks, who are doing their best to keep a roof over their heads by cobbling together multiple jobs. And for these women, many of them are working outside of the home to help make ends meet, but they're hoping and they're praying that hopefully one day that won't be their life. So the promise of patriarchy in many ways is a promise for both men and women. It's a promise to men that they will be able to take care of their families financially, keep a roof over their head, meet their material needs. It's a promise to women that I am going to marry someone who's going to do this for me. And by doing this for me, I'm going to stand up and be the best wife and mother and citizen of the Nation of Islam because I have reaped the benefits of being a stay-at-home mom.
You mentioned that you had the chance to interview Belinda Boyd, and there's several other sort of formal oral histories that you conducted in the writing of this. But when trying to understand the experiences of less well-known rank and file women on the ground, especially in the earlier periods of the movement in the 1930s and 1940s, what types of sources were you using to get at their experiences?
That's a great question because in many ways, the 1930s and the period prior to World War II is the period that we know the least about the Nation of Islam. And so for me, that's the part that I was most curious about, I must say. I had gone to different archives, the Schomburg Library in New York City, read all kinds of iterations of Muhammad Speaks, but it wasn't until I went to a public library in Detroit. And I want to underscore public library because scholars, we often think we have to go to these, archives that have these amazing archivists who can give us all of these primary documents that we have to wear gloves to turn the page with. And the fact of the matter, I found a document in the Detroit Public Library that I had never seen cited in any of the secondary literature that I had read. And it was a document that was produced in 1930 by a group of agencies in Detroit who were concerned about families taking their children out of school. And so this document, it reignited my interest in the Nation of Islam, and it really exposed to me how important it was for mothers to be able to educate their children on their own terms, and how these women took their children out of school. And when the attendance office said, you have to bring them back, they said no, they stood firm. And because of their willingness to stand up for their children and stand firm, a record was created, a record that was created that I was able to tap back into. And so with that, in terms of the records, at that same public library, I began to look at just the local newspapers of the period. I think oftentimes we lean into newspapers that are digitized, and that's very important. But there are a host of local newspapers that the libraries don't have the money to digitize, where you have to go in and you have to comb through them. Oftentimes, they're not even digitized on microfilm. You have to read the newspaper. And that's what I did. And in doing that, I was able to find a narrative of the police having problems with the group that they called the Allah Temple of Islam, with the school district having problems with the group, and they called it the Allah Temple of Islam because the participants were calling it that. And so I was able to create a narrative of those early years from the local newspapers and from that one document that I happened to find in the main local public library. So I think for scholars who want to write about an organization, a movement, a happening where they say there's no records for it, there may not be any traditional records for it. The records that you can just punch in on your computer and boom, you get the US Census, right? You only get the US Census to a certain point, but there's no substitute, in my opinion, to going to the local place that you're most interested in. Going to the local place, going to the local libraries, talking to people at the library who can say, oh, yes, I know someone's parents or friend or my neighbor was a part of that organization. And you begin to learn about the local history and how the local people understand what you're interested in. And this is how you create connections to that history and hopefully, possibly some oral interviews to follow up. Lastly, I would say that for the early period, I also found quite a bit of information on eBay. I want to say this because as more and more families realize the value of their history, the value of those papers in their attics and in their basements, many of them are not just giving them to local libraries where they're crossing their fingers that they might be digitized in a value. What they're saying is, I see the value of this and I'm going to sell it. I'm going to take a picture of it. I'm going to put it together in a little pamphlet form and I'm going to sell it. And so I began to find local pieces of ephemera, if you will, of the early Nation of Islam on eBay. And I found one family, I noticed they keep on selling stuff. And that one family was the family of Bernstein Muhammad, who was the secretary of Clara Muhammad. So if it hadn't been for eBay, I would have never been able to make that particular circle back to that family. And the fact that they were selling materials, in my opinion, meant that perhaps they might be open to a conversation. And they were, and I'm so very thankful.
What you said reminds me of Jarvis Given's fantastic book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, where he's not only looking at Carter Woodson as a historical and intellectual figure, but he's also digging into the individual histories of the Black teachers who are the first ones on the front lines teaching Black history in Virginia and throughout the nation. So I think what you're pointing out is that if you get something that everyone can access, like the Carter Woodson papers or like the papers of the Schomburg or in other areas, you have to chase down those other traces of information that exist in other places to be able to get the full story of what's going on the ground. As a professor, though, it can be really hard to teach students, both undergraduate and graduate students, to push further than the initial silences that they get to. What advice might you have for students to engage the silences or the brick walls that they find to seek after additional information?
First of all, I love that you brought up Jarvis Givens because I chaired his dissertation. I'm not sure if you are aware of that.
I actually had no idea. I'm really pleased to hear this.
I chaired Jarvis's dissertation. So in many ways, I guess you could say he's a former student who I helped to expose the importance of digging and the importance of the archives during a moment when the archive is rightfully critiqued for all of its structural power and how that structural power has pushed so many voices to the margins and to the periphery. So I would begin by saying, in the case of Jarvis, his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, is based on his dissertation that I worked with him on. I always insist that my students have at least one archive. And I insist upon it because I want them to understand that it's with these kinds of documents that there is so much more. And our job is to take that document and push and read between the lines and push and read on the grain of the archive. That sometimes means that one is engaged in a form of informed speculation. I want to underscore informed. That is not just making up stuff, but taking all of the context of what you're interested in to figure out how can I create a narrative? How can I produce a story that's grounded in archival evidence, but also speaking to what the archive is leaving out because of the violence in the structuring of archives. And so when you talked about Gibbon's text, how he found these teachers who would basically have books and they would have them on their laps. And when the principal would come into the room, they would go back to what was on their desk. But the students understood that there was a different kind of pedagogy being layered on what Jim Crow detailed what was required of the teacher for the students. I have to say that sometimes it's hard for students they feel what else can be said on a topic? What else can be written on a topic? I often try to get them to be self-reflective around what they do know and the people that they know and the lives that they've witnessed and experienced themselves, their own life, and how there are so many different versions and how we need to think about all of those multiple versions when we think about anything. And so while there are, 100 books on Abraham Lincoln, maybe 100 books on Martin Luther King, that we should think that there can be 100 books on the Nation of Islam and that there can be 100 books on Ella Baker. And if we are of that mindset, I think we will approach the archives very, very differently and begin to look at what's there as opposed to what's missing.
When I sat down to read your book for the first time a couple of weeks ago to start it, I began by reading the acknowledgments, which I always do because I feel like it can help me learn a lot about an author. And you note right at the beginning in the first words of your acknowledgments that you wrote this book while grieving the loss of your best friend and last surviving sibling, Willa Nanette Taylor, and that her passing was accompanied by that of other dear ones. First off, I'm so sorry to hear of your siblings' passings and the loss of your other loved ones. But I'm curious how your own family history, how those own family relationships have shaped the scholarly questions and methods that you employ as a scholar.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for reading the acknowledgments because I'm also like you, Christopher. I go for those acknowledgments too because I just kind of want to see where the journey has taken them throughout the writing of a text. And for me, first of all, thank you for saying my sister's full name, Willa Nanette Taylor. And she, along with so many other people, are no longer on the planet. But I do believe in everlasting life. And so for me, that belief in everlasting life comes from my formative years. My family were raised in a deep Church of God in Christ religious weekly activity. That means not just Sunday. That's why I said weekly activity. My grandmother was the mother of a very small church, Greater Mount Zion Church of God in Christ in Pasadena, California. The fact that I can say it that quickly means that it was very important in all of our formative years. It was a very small family church, like 5 or 6 families, and we were one of them. And it was in this church that, and largely because of my grandmother's just, oh my gosh, deeply intense belief in fairness and justice, and as opposed to vengeance, that my family, we were encouraged to live up to that. And that means hold people accountable when we felt they weren't fair to us. Believe in justice and therefore advocate for it. And so I grew up, first of all, in that kind of Christian spiritual life. But I also grew up at a time when busing was coming into existence. And so my early years, I only went to Black schools. And this is in California. So oftentimes we think about Jim Crow only as a Southern phenomenon, right? This is in Pasadena, California. And it wasn't until I think the 5th grade that I was bused outside of my Black neighborhood into a white school. And I'll never forget, we were bused to San Rafael, which was, I guess it would be considered maybe a suburb. I'm not quite sure, but a more financially wealthy area that was largely white populated. And I remember my mother, she was with us at the bus stop on our block. But then when we went to San Rafael, there were all of these parents, particularly white mothers, not letting us get off the bus. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're not going to let us get off the bus. So oftentimes when we think about those eyes on the prize images of Boston, where you have parents not letting children get off the bus, in little old Pasadena, California, in San Rafael, the parents were resistant to us getting off the bus. And I remember going home, I was saying, you should have went there as opposed to here. And it took a couple of days and we ended up going, getting off the bus and going to school. And it was the first time that I had white classmates, that I had white teachers. And prior to that, I only had Black teachers and Black classmates. I think being able to witness how with busing, that local Black school that I walked to around the corner got a set of new paint. It received new swings and got something that was called a barrel. This thing you could get in and just kind of run in. Because in Pasadena, busing was 2 directions. It wasn't just one way. Black students were bused to white schools. White students were bused to Black schools. So they were forced to invest in those schools that they had neglected in terms of the structures that they had neglected. But the education that I received in San Rafael wasn't any better than the education that I had received at Cleveland Elementary School, but the facilities were different. And I think also the way in which different people brought different class experiences and cultural differences into the classroom, I think it is my way of understanding the world, and I'm appreciative of that. And so going back to your question, how did my own family history and formative years kind of tap into the questions that I have been interested in? I think growing up and seeing and experiencing Black life made me always interested in the possibilities of Black nation building. What are the possibilities when Black people come together to have particular kinds of experiences out of the gaze of whiteness? At the same time, I understood some of the value that I received with busing and desegregation in terms of there is a benefit to diversity in the classroom. I learned from my peers in ways that I otherwise would not have. And I think that stretched me as a thinker and an intellectual. And clearly, as a person who also benefited from affirmative action, I went to UCLA in 1980, and affirmative action made that possible for me. And I'm so clear about that. And I understand the value of how my presence in the classroom helped my peers and how my peers helped me become more tolerant. So I think all of that shaped my thinking and my drive to protect and expose why people were vulnerable, to expose how class and the saturation of exploitive capitalism can just destroy and amplify homes, and how, in the end, most people want human human qualities, right? They want to be able to feed their children. They want to be able to educate their families. They want to be able to have a little joy and laughter. They want to be able to embrace music. And these are the things, in my opinion, that make us human and just connect us all. So I would say all of these things have impacted my world. And I put a lot of energy and effort into exposing that into my students and hopefully other people in the classroom that just kind of tap into me one time.
I don't mean to be saccharine when I say this, but it's like the more people I meet, the more people I love. That seems to be true both in the present, but also in the past. The more people that I'm reading about their experiences, the more I connect with them. Is there a way that in your scholarship or that you see the potential in anyone's scholarship for family or kinship to help us rethink dominant narratives about social relations, but maybe especially about patriarchal organizations like the Nation of Islam?
Yes, I think family history is so very, very important because, first of all, it shakes loose this whole idea that history comes from the top down and that the people who are not fabulous and famous are not important to the landscape of the planet. So for me, family history gets at the nuances of the everyday that are so important that in many ways make life worth living. I think that family history allows us to take naming practices, for example, as a way to get at honoring the past, honoring people who fall outside of history because they are not famous or because they haven't done something that would land them in the newspaper. It becomes a way in which to honor traditions and that might appear to be, meaningless, but in fact give meaning to people's lives. I remember in my class one year, I asked students about, folklore practices. And I asked them, tell me how you set up your kitchen. How is your refrigerator like the one that you left? Do you put sugar in the refrigerator because in your home, that's what you did? Do you put fruit in the windowsill because you saw someone doing that? So how, in fact, has your upbringing been mapped onto your life outside of your home? And how might that upbringing might be mapped on your future family so that people can understand that what we take for granted are actually the qualities that make us unique and beautiful and loving and joyful and wanting to spread positivity because it impacted us in a positive way. And I think family history gets at those subtle nuances that are so very, very important and that in many ways shake loose from race and class and culture because it affirms who we are and why our lives are so important.
Let the church say amen. Thank you so much, Eula. I want to conclude with a final question that we like to ask guests, and that is, what is a book that has recently ignited your historical imagination? What is something that has really helped kind of expand your mind and the way that you think about things recently?
The book that I have recently read, and I have to tell you, I have read a lot of books lately because I've been reviewing a lot of folks for promotion. And I've read a lot of dissertations because my students are putting closure on that work too. A dissertation that I've read that hopefully will become a book, but if not, you can check it out as a dissertation. And believe it or not, she filed it today. Her name is Natasha Ford, and it's on memory workers. Basically, women who are archivists, that is, they save things that are important to them because they know that they are important to other people. And she frames this around memory work. So I want people to definitely check out her work in the future. But the book that's published that I recently read that I absolutely fell in love with is by Paula Marie Seniors, Seniors. And it's titled May Mallory, the Monroe Defense Committee, and World Revolutions, African American Women Radical Activists. And this book is so wonderful, not just because of the history. We read a lot of history that's transformative and insightful, but for me, it's the framing of the text that I found so inviting. So Paula Sr.'s, her parents were activists in the May Mallory Monroe Defense Committee. And so she writes about her parents, but she also writes about what she remembers in the moment. And she writes about May Mallory, and she interviews May Mallory's daughter about what she remembered in the moment. So you have this layering of activism coming from the archives of the activists themselves, and then the memories of the children who witnessed it. And the way she's a beautiful writer, and the way in which she layered and retold multiple memories, I think is just really, really beautiful and a model for many of us who are writing about living subjects, who are writing about former activists, and trying to figure out how can we break the third wall, if they say, or break this whole idea of objectivity and neutrality, and just basically say, you know what, this was my mother, and you know her for these reasons. And these reasons are correct, but I too know her for some additional reasons. And let me tell you what they are. And I just found this book just beautiful, and I learned a great deal as well.
Eula Taylor, thanks for joining us on Reunion.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us on Reunion. Family history isn't just about names and dates, it's about relationships and how those relationships have shaped laws, power, and the structures that govern our everyday lives. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really helps others find the show. We'll be back soon with more discussions about why family history matters, because family history is history.